My name is Michael Steinberg. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin. It's an enormous pleasure, even more than I can tell you, to be here tonight to introduce the Bertolt Leibinger lecture, and especially to introduce indirectly our Bertolt Leibinger lecturer, Professor Rebecca Boehling. I say indirectly because the real introductory work will be done by our colleague Katrin Meyer, who is also a close friend and longtime colleague of our lecturer. The Bertolt Leibinger lecture is a very welcome and special event for us here, named after our very cherished trustee and one of the members of what we can call the Stuttgart elite of Friends of the American Academy. The Leibinger family, in fact, is involved in multiple generations with the American Academy. If you have the temerity to walk a bit in the dark afterwards and see the wonderful Fellows Pavilion that was designed by Regina Leibinger, Bertolt Leibinger's daughter, you'll see exactly what I mean. It's especially rewarding to have among us in this very wonderful, really sold-out lecture other very dear friends of the Academy, Michael Giesen and Almut Giesen, whom I remember as very loyal visitors during my fellowship semester in 2003, which is a number of years ago. And I also want to call out Lutz Niethammer, who is with us tonight. Lutz, there you are, who longer ago in 1993 hosted an extremely unusual conference in Essen, where you were at that point, which I remember as really a very unusually interesting occasion that I would love to talk with all of you about later, that has stuck with me ever since. And finally, to go back even further in time, Rebecca and I figured out that we had met sometime in the mid-1980s when we were really both babies. I'm not speaking biologically, I'm speaking academically. We were introduced at a conference as kids, as young historians, by a very esteemed mutual colleague of ours. So as everything else with the Academy, this is a moment of present and future scholarship, but also of really a great kind of loyalty to and critical loyalty to the past. It is a pleasure to welcome Dr. Meyer, Katrin Meyer. Dr. Meyer and Professor Boehling have, as I mentioned, known each other for many years. They met for the first time during dissertation work during Rebecca's dissertation work on denazification in Washington, and Rebecca Boehling was at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies with a visiting fellowship at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. When Professor Boehling was head of the ITS, they continued to work together as the ITS is an international partner of the IHRA. So with pleasure and without further length, I'll give the floor to Katrin Meyer. After the lecture, there will be a question and answer period, which I believe Rebecca Boehling will handle herself, and we'll continue with drinks after that, close to 9 p.m. So thanks so much, and onward.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. Ladies and gentlemen, I felt deeply honored when my dear colleague and friend Rebecca Boehling asked me to introduce her lecture on transnational justice and Western allied approaches to denazification at the American Academy tonight. It is a privilege to introduce Rebecca Boehling, Professor of History, Affiliate Professor of Judaic Studies, and Affiliate Professor of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, UMBC. Being the Bertolt Leibinger Fellow here at the Academy in Berlin in the fall class of 2016 is just one of many fellowships Professor Boehling had in the past. I won't list all her positions, awards, and achievements. You all know Professor Boehling is a distinguished scholar, always up for new challenges, and with a more impressive list of publications. In 1997, actually, when I started my research on the special aspect of the US Army's denazification policy in internment camps in Germany, during which I wanted to focus especially on the denazification of mid-level Nazi women, I was astonished about the fact that not that much historical research had been done in that field, and almost none analyzing the gender aspects of denazification. That came as a surprise, given the enormous interest in the history of National Socialism, the Holocaust, World War II in general, and its aftermath. But of course, one of the first names I came across in this field was Rebecca Boehling, and it was actually her first book, A Question of Priorities, Democratic Reform and Economic Recovery in Post-War Germany, as well as one of her earlier articles, Mothers into Politics, American Democratization Efforts After 1945, that brought us together in the first place. When we met for the first time in 1999 at the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C., I asked her in detail about her publications, and she was so kind to discuss my project, gave me important advice for my research, and later invited me to present my thesis to one of her classes at UMBC. Ever since, our paths have crossed again and again. And while we share a common interest in the US denazification policy in post-war Germany, and we both also bring the gender issue into our research where possible, we also discovered an interesting difference in our research. It is not only that I entered this field as an educator, and Rebecca obviously as an historian. Rebecca focused in the beginning very much on German anti-Nazis who became victims of National Socialism, while I focused exclusively on perpetrators, collaborators, and bystanders in the field of denazification. But of course, all this happened in the same field, denazification. I find it interesting that when we both actually changed our professional focus, we took a similar turn again, away from denazification and towards the history of the victims of the Holocaust. I left academia altogether in 2004 when I started working for the OSCE first and then moved on to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance a few years later. About the same time, Rebecca started her project on the Kaufmann-Steinberg family together with Uta Lagley. Based on the letters of 8 family members over 2 generations, they tell the moving story of a family torn apart during the Holocaust and divided between 3 countries. Their book, Life and Lost in the Shadow of the Holocaust, A Jewish Family's Untold Story, was published in 2011. Shortly after that book was published, Rebecca Boehling took a bold move in her career by accepting the position of the director of the International Tracing Service, the ITS, in Bad Arolsen in 2013. She was the first ITS director not appointed by the International Red Cross, but by the International Commission of the ITS, consisting of 11 states. Being a researcher herself, Rebecca brought a deep understanding of the necessity to further open the ITS approximately 30 million documents on the fates of victims of Nazi persecution and liberated survivors. To open these files to researchers, and she also saw the urgent need to professionalize the support that would be provided by the ITS, and she established exactly that. So here we were, again in the same area, this time in the field of Holocaust remembrance and research, but in a world so different from academia, both working for institutions ruled by governments. I was excited to have Rebecca kind of relatively close in Bad Arolsen, and our organizations became official partners in 2014. Therefore, I was sad to see her leave the ITS last year. But on the other hand, I was glad to see her return to research of her own, not mainly enabling the research of others by running an archive. And I was especially excited to learn that she would go back to researching denazification and its connection to transnational justice. The desire to re-educate or to change the mindset of a society is an enormous challenge. During processes of political change, from dictatorships to democracy, after mass violence, crimes against humanity, genocide, or war, unfortunately, there is no reset button for a society. But the denazification policy of the occupying forces in post-war Germany was actually one of the first attempts to do exactly that, to reset Germany and to purge Nazi influence by legal and non-legal measures. The questions asked back then are still valid today. How can a society confront its past, come to terms with it, develop a peaceful coexistence for all involved, and establish democracy? And can all this be forced upon them or even just initiated from the outside? With her academy project on denazification and transitional justice, Rebecca Boehling widens the focus of her research now to all Western allies approaches. She's analyzing the theories of the different allies and how those were put into practice. So I feel actually very privileged to be here tonight among this distinguished audience and to have the opportunity to learn about Professor Boehling's latest research in an historical area that is of such political relevance today.
I guess it's my turn. Okay. First of all, welcome. I'd like to thank the American Academy and the Bertold Reibinger Foundation for hosting me this semester. I would also like to thank Michael Steinberg for being here and greeting us, and my longtime friend and colleague Katrin Meyer for her introduction. Programs like the Berlin Prize Program and the many events the Academy sponsors, thanks to its donors and its wonderful programming and hospitality staff, appear to run effortlessly. But as someone who has done time on the administrative side of academic and institutional life, I appreciate so much all that is done by so many people to enrich and facilitate fellows' research and intellectual development, and to spoil us with wonderful food and drink, clean up our apartments, etc. Of course, none of us want to return to real life. I just want to acknowledge specifically by name Thomas Rommel, Carol Scherer, and Ashley Bamford, who so graciously respond to my many questions and suggestions, as well as librarian Yolanda Korb and IT specialist Joachim Feske, who have worked so hard to get me books and maintain my ability to compute, scan, and print, and give presentations like this one. I also want to single out the dining room staff, especially Stefan Choska, whose patience and graciousness have been amazing in the midst of the kitchen's own staffing challenges, even helping us with special comfort food menus to get us through the post-election shock earlier this month. So if you had any questions about how I voted, I think you now know. Those of us who knew me in my recent configuration as the director of the International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen, or who have read my 2011 co-authored book on a German Jewish family from Essen, on the eve of, during, and after the Holocaust, may well wonder what brings me to denazification. My first book looked at the return of self-government in 3 German cities under US occupation, with more emphasis on democratization, or at least the return of self-government to the Germans. Oops. Oops. What happened? Oh, here's page 2. Then on the other 3 Ds of the Potsdam Agreement, the treaty ending World War II Europe, namely denazification, demilitarization, and decartelization. Over a decade ago, I began to revisit denazification as a specific policy, interested in how plans and theories played out in practice and how the interaction between occupier and occupied transformed the practice. I also viewed re-education and reorientation not just as pedagogical and cultural policies, but rather, as Germans would say, in übertragenen Sinne, as inherently related to demilitarization and denazification, and thus very much a part of democratization. But what is denazification? It came to be identified with the arrest, detention, and removal from office of Nazis in occupied Germany. In practice, those deemed incriminated on the basis of various membership and behavior criteria were to be removed from public or influential positions, at least until they could be appropriately punished and thus eventually rehabilitated. However, this narrow definition was not how the concept was initially conceived. The word denazification itself originated in April 1945 with the Office of the Director of Political Affairs to General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, and concurrently the initial military governor for the U.S. zone of occupation. It was used as the title for a header for an appendix of a series of planned U.S. occupation directives. 9 type directives were included under this rubric of denazification. Since I have them up there and I have a bit of a hoarse throat, I'm going to let you read them. Needless to say, this is a much broader category than simply a purge of former Nazis from public positions and includes the elimination of many elements of Nazi political, cultural, and societal influences, as transmitted through education, media, culture, the legal system, and the public sector. And I just wanted to show you an image. This is, as you might recognize, a British soldier actually accompanying German civilians to look at Bergen-Belsen. So in many cases, the local populations were required to go into former concentration camps. And one could say this is also related to denazification. So let me see if I can go back here. But it is important to note that the concept of denazification did not cover the prosecution of war crimes or crimes against humanities, such as held at Nuremberg and the successor trials. And that level of criminal justice is not what I will be talking about tonight. In fact, I won't even be talking about automatic arrest or detention camps, but more the process of denazifying civilian society. This is, of course, the Nuremberg trials. So not what I'm talking about, but it was clearly a major point for the media at the time. Now let me explain how I came to the current approach I am taking to this project. I knew from my research on the US zone that the implementation of all occupation policies was influenced and shaped by the other allies and developments in their zones as well as back at home, including, of course, the Cold War. Thus, a more comparative approach to denazification in the Western zone seemed appropriate to me. But once I decided to enter into this comparative world, over a decade ago, the war in Iraq had just come onto the horizon. I found myself briefly in the media limelight as Iraqi exiles, hoping for US intervention in Iraq, began planning for a post-Saddam Hussein Iraq and what they called de-Baathification. Despite my warnings about problems inherent in the US policy of denazification, the major differences between the situation in Iraq and that of post-World War II Germany, and my own strong feelings against a US war in Iraq, denazification was used by these exiles as a model for planning de-Baathification. Such warnings as mine were of interest to then Radio Liberty and Canadian Broadcasting, and briefly NPR and Reuters, but certainly not of interest to the US government or Paul Bremer at the time. I was at least able to encourage Ali Alawi of the Iraqi National Congress, who had asked my advice on the applicability of denazification for a de-Baathification, to go to South Africa and to explore Truth and Reconciliation Commissions as another possible model. Although Alawi later held various cabinet posts in the interim Iraqi Governing Council and was a member of the Transitional National Assembly, he never was involved in any sort of de-Baathification or purge, returning, somewhat disillusioned, to London in 2006, where he had spent most of his life, and publishing since then on why the war and occupation were a mistake. All of this made me think about what it might mean to frame denazification as a form of transitional justice, as opposed to simply a part of occupation studies. I am not a transitional justice specialist, nor is my approach to denazification a judicial one focused on criminal prosecution. But I think it is useful to consider the concept and the theory behind and lessons learned from the practice of transitional justice as we revisit the process of denazification. And I do realize that most theories behind and practices of transitional justice are not framed within the context of foreign military occupation. But nevertheless, let's try this. In March 2010, the Secretary General of the UN issued guidelines on transitional justice. I quote, "For the United Nations, transitional justice is the full range of processes and mechanisms associated with a society's attempt to come to terms with a legacy of large-scale past abuses in order to ensure accountability, serve justice, and achieve reconciliation. Transitional justice processes and mechanisms are a critical component of the United Nations framework for strengthening the rule of law, end of quote. Of course, the UN was not thinking of denazification when it developed this framework, but certainly the, quote, attempt to come to terms with a legacy of large-scale past abuses in order to ensure accountability, serve justice, and achieve reconciliation would apply to denazification as well. I would like to look at some of the discussions about transitional justice, particularly prior to this UN statement. I am aided here by the work of the Berghoff Foundation, especially a piece by Martina Fischer entitled Transitional Justice and Reconciliation, Theory and Practice. The international human rights movement initially developed the concept of transitional justice, referring to the judicial process of addressing, during the process of democratic transition, human rights violations committed by a dictatorial or repressive regime. In the meantime, its meaning has been extended to cover the establishment of tribunals, truth commissions, purge or political cleansing of state administrations, settlement on reparations, and also political and societal initiatives devoted to fact-finding and also cultures of remembrance. Truth commissions in particular, something neither Germany nor the World War II allies really had in mind, are envisaged as a means for civil society, as Neil Kritz of the U.S. Institute of Peace writes, to engage and confront all of society in a painful national dialogue with serious soul-searching and attempt to look at the ills within society that makes abuses possible. Here I cannot help but think of Theodor Adorno's concept of coming to terms with or grappling with the past, as opposed to overcoming it. And here I'm playing with the German term, and for those of you that don't speak German, I wanted to impress you with how long a word you can have in German. This is, of course, one word, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, and I wanted to just a little bit play with the different ways in which it is sometimes used and interpreted. I think you can see the difference. Some argue that Truth and Reconciliation Commission should be established, quote, only where a robust civil society remains intact, and recommend that in a context that lacks a civil society altogether, a more top-down approach may be appropriate. The experience of truth commissions has revealed that apart from a strong civil society, there is a need for reliable alliance partners in parliaments, governments, and administrations who are willing to engage in institutional reforms and establish the rule of law. Again, military governments do not come to mind immediately here, but the Allies were indeed concerned in occupied Germany with paving the way for a reestablishment of the rule of law. As the journalist and special advisor on transitional justice and conflict mediation, Pierre Hazan has noted, the Nuremberg trials after World War II were regarded as victor's justice by much of the German population and failed to have an immediate effect in terms of initiating debates in West Germany. But they became an important part of reference a generation later in the mid to late 1960s, and thus contributed to informing German society once initiatives for facing the past had begun to develop on a larger scale. And although, as we will see, the actual practice of denazification came to be seen as inconsistent and unfair, the concept behind it as a reckoning with the past and a holding people accountable certainly eventually played into similar German initiatives to face the past. Some of the transitional justice literature of the last 15 years has centered on the dichotomy of peace versus justice on the one hand and truth versus justice. In the peace versus justice debate, advocates of the legalist approach have emphasized that criminal justice stigmatizes the elites who perpetuate conflict and helps separate individual from collective guilt. Some skeptics of this argue for domestic prosecutions based on the conviction that justice should follow rather than precede the consolidation of peace. In some late 20th century debates surrounding transitional justice, bargains and amnesties, rather than prosecutions, were often seen as the best ways to achieve peace because of the need to contain so-called spoilers in many post-conflict regions. In fact, bargains and amnesties instituted by the Allies contributed significantly to the discrediting of denazification, but we will look at that later in my talk. Following the 2009 reports of the President of the UN International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, theorists of transitional justice have come to reject the idea of impunity and emphasize that amnesties, if applied at all, should be introduced as partial and conditional. I am not sure yet how this lens of transitional justice fits into an analysis of denazification. But several of the early theories in the planning phases of denazification, which I'm about to explore with you here, smack of the same concerns as those found among those theorizing, practicing, and critiquing transitional justice processes. And several of the differences among the Western allies in their initial practice of denazification mirror the peace versus justice, often framed more as security versus justice, and the truth versus justice debate, with the British, for example, taking a more legalistic approach to denazification than the Americans or the French, who in their own way strove for truth, but who along the way retreated into amnesties and bargains. The result was that few Germans felt at the time that either truth or justice had been served by denazification. The transitional justice literature presumes for the most part that a post-dictatorial society is seeking and finding transitional justice for itself. I quote again Neil Kritz of the U.S. Institute for Peace. In a context that lacks a civil society altogether, a more top-down approach may be appropriate. Apart from the prerequisite of a strong civil society, which certainly Germany after 12 years of the Third Reich did not have, there is a need for reliable alliance partners in parliaments, governments, and administrations who are willing to engage in institutional reforms and establish the rule of law. The Allies did help to initiate institutional reforms and establish the rule of law. What I want to do now is explore the theories behind denazification in its planning phase, then compare and contrast these theories with the practice of denazification in the three Western zones, and at the end revisit the question of the relevance of considering denazification within the framework of transitional justice. Denazification was an integral part of the World War II Allies' program to transform Germany from a xenophobic, aggressive, authoritarian state into a peace-loving democratic nation that would once again cooperate in and contribute to international life. Yet both the theory and practice of denazification was dependent on whether one defined it as merely a personnel purge of certain Nazis or a more structural purification and elite transformation. It also depended on how narrowly one defined democratization, simply holding free elections, or as removing authoritarian structures and practices, as well as implementing democratic decision-making. How closely concepts of denazification were tied to concepts of democratization varied among the Western Allies. How plans played out in practice also varied over time and place, and were influenced by other economic, social, and political developments in the zones and among the occupiers themselves. Got an interesting reversal of pages here, so bear with me. I could have just, of course, skipped that page, but I think I won't. Americans were the most active of the Western Allies in planning for denazification. That and the fact that my comparative work is still in its infancy stage mean my primary focus in this talk tonight will be on the US, with occasional interweaving of comparative aspects that should resound with discussions on transitional justice. Walter Dorn an historian and an analyst for the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, and denazification advisor to the military governor of the U.S. zone, noted that the approach to how National Socialism was to be expunged effectively as an active force from the political, economic, and cultural life of post-war Germany varied according to the analysis of what the driving forces of National Socialism actually were, and how completely it had fastened its stranglehold on German life. Dorn argued that above all, it was an outlaw theory of Nazism that influenced American denazification policy. This outlaw theory promoted a purge based on individual responsibility and the degree of complicity in the Nazi regime. Dorn felt that Joint Chiefs of Staff, or JCS 1067, the U.S. occupation policy directive that officially was in effect from July 45 until July 47, combined this outlaw-based, individualized program of punishment of political elites with a Morgenthau Plan-like program of punishment against an entire society. The strategy based on the outlaw theory stressed socioeconomic continuity under the condition that the Nazi leaders be punished as international criminals and accordingly be removed from the picture. This would supposedly liberate the remaining non-Nazis and thus enable them to reconstruct a liberal order according to capitalist, parliamentary, and constitutional principles. The strategy foresaw a personnel purge that went beyond the political Nazi elite, and which, in combination with tight political controls associated with a Morgenthau Plan-like drastic reduction of the industrial plant, was supposed to reduce Germany's potential for aggression. JCS 1067 attempted to create a compromise by promoting some level of social democratization and harmony via a change of personnel in the top leadership positions, while gradually subduing and ultimately disavowing the punitive aspects and the repressive consequences of denazification and an associated collective guilt thesis. This was intended to create a less antagonistic occupation, requiring fewer military government personnel and a more expeditious road to German economic recovery and reintegration into the capitalist system. Such an occupation would thus also satisfy many of the concerns of the American War Department about getting U.S. personnel back home. It would also allay the State Department's concern for Germany's economic recovery because of Germany's increasingly strategic role as a bulwark against communist expansion. There were also denazification-related proposals in the United States involving a more thorough structural change within Germany. These stemmed from a desire to prevent not only a revival of the Third Reich, but also German authoritarian tendencies, while nurturing older German democratic traditions. These structural initiatives came from the least influential quarters of U.S. occupation planning. In late 1943, the Research and Analysis Branch of the OSS was given the task of preparing manuals for military government that would provide insights into the German social order and make suggestions for contending with denazification and local administration. And just as an aside, the OSS, of course, had many émigrés and German specialists within it. There were quite a few members of the former Frankfurt School, et cetera. It was a really, if you ever look at any of their reports, they're incredibly sophisticated. The OSS manuals foresaw not only the removal of the Nazi elite, but also the eradication of the social basis of National Socialism. The OSS social elite theory regarded Nazi incrimination and complicity as existing not only among the highest echelons of the party hierarchy and the government elite, but also within the internal party and social structure, including among economic elites. Yet the OSS criteria for denazification proposed a qualitative measure, which was to keep the number of people to be investigated to a manageable minimum. As it turned out, the actual U.S. military government policy of denazification tended to stress quantity. The historian and former OSS analyst Karl Schorsky maintained in 1948 that both US and British occupation policy ultimately had been, quote, based on a conception of the nature of Nazism as a thing of the mind, an evil idea that would have to be rooted out through the elimination of the bearers of the idea and the re-education of the German people as a whole. This conception of Nazism involved the introduction of no change in the fundamental structure of society. Property relations were to remain unchanged. Administration was to be largely entrusted to putatively non-political middle-class technicians. Thus, the continuity of the social structure of Imperial, Weimar, and National Socialist Germany was to be maintained in the Western zones. The British occupation authorities often based their approaches to Germany on experiences with colonial rule, where the colonizers worked through and with the indigenous people with experience and expertise, indeed controlling and often distrusting them, but trying to transform them or their societal structures, but trying not to transform their societal structures. Denazification procedures in the US zone stipulated that beyond removing all more than nominal Nazis from public office and from positions of importance in quasi-public and private enterprises, that also to be removed were, quote, active supporters of Nazism or militarism when they have, one, held office or otherwise been active at any level, from local to national, in the party and its subordinate organizations, or in organizations which further militaristic doctrines. Two, authorized or participated affirmatively in any Nazi crimes, racial persecutions, or discriminations. Three, been avowed believers in Nazism or racial and militaristic creeds. Four, voluntarily given substantial moral or material support or political assistance of any kind to the Nazi Party or Nazi officials and leaders. Explicitly, the policy stated, no such persons shall be retained in any of the categories of employment listed above because of administrative necessity, convenience, or expediency. This scope was incredibly broad, with the first criteria more membership-based and the latter more based on individual behavior. Individual behavior, of course, being much more complex to evaluate. By the end of September 1945, two new directives widened the scope of denazification in the US zone. On the one hand, to encourage a purge of the professional classes of doctors and lawyers, under the rationale that although they had not held public office, they had held positions of wealth, prominence, and influence in their respective communities. And secondly, to purify, quote unquote, to purify the German economy. This widening of scope beyond public officials hinted at social transformation. It was the closest the OSS structuralist approach to denazification came to realization in directive form. The directive dealing with business and industry, known as Law Number 8, was intended to limit professional, vocational participation by all active party members to ordinary labor. It placed the burden of proof on the accused, but most significantly, it removed the administrative burden from military government and instead made use of German review boards that were to be appointed at the local level by the mayor or county commissioner, Landrat, who presumably would be more qualified than military government to evaluate behavior. German public opinion, except in business circles, seemed favorably inclined toward the policy, and the newly licensed trade unions in particular supported Law Number 8. Yet in practice, often only when news of specific Nazis remaining in power or being appointed to top post reached the American public, was there a detectable intensification of denazification by military government. In other words, you had these policies, but the reality was the implementation. The crackdowns were usually only temporary. I had in here a great example that I took out for time reasons, but I have to mention it. You've probably all heard of the comment made by General Patton, who was at the time one of the people supposed to be in charge of denazification, where he compared Nazis and anti-Nazis with Democrats and Republicans. Yeah. Thought I'd get a reaction from you. When U.S. Army officers in charge of the German factories that supplied the Army blatantly rejected denazification in their factories with the argument that production comes first, General Eisenhower responded by transferring control of these production agencies over to military government, so from the Army to military government. Eisenhower did not realize that military government's priorities in practice were often not all that different. When military government was placed formally in charge of a company, it frequently felt it needed and therefore kept the original factory owner or manager in the top post, or formally replaced him while keeping him in a lower position. Numerous politically incriminated managers and executives often only had to bide their time a short while before they were restored to their positions, whether secretly or by a change in their formal job classification. Of course, there was the problem that only those who had joined the NSDAP fell under the jurisdiction of Law Number 8, a practice ignoring OSS warnings about the fact that some quite incriminated individuals who had managed not to join the party, as well as the fact that some joiners were at best nominal members. So in other words, the schematic classification had a real downside. U.S. military government detachment officers made a concession of justice to utility when they retained certain German officials liable for dismissal, but considered indispensable to the economy and to the administration of government. Many military government detachment officers, either career military or engineers or technocrats in civilian life, felt torn between achieving administrative efficiency and following denazification directives. In such a dilemma, they tended to rely on incumbent German government officials, industrial, utilities, and business managers, technicians, and workers, whom they considered essential for the effective performance of the military government officers' responsibilities. In the British zone, occupation authorities dealing with industry and commerce often were conservative industrialists and bankers themselves, which oriented them to the technical task at hand and expediency rather than political or even moral concerns, including German industry's use of forced or slave labor, which in some cases they all but continued. British concerns with their own economic recovery and the growing problems of food shortages in their zone of occupation encouraged giving a speedy German economic recovery a high priority. To do so, they excluded large categories of German activities from denazification altogether. The British claimed that they were following the same basic denazification rules and regulations as the Americans, but never intended to evaluate nearly as many adult Germans, especially in the economy. Instead, they focused on political elites and those deemed most incriminated. The British considered German militarism and nationalism so widespread that only those Germans truly dangerous to security really would need to be targeted for removal from influence. In other words, there's a certain contradiction here. If they're all bad, we can't get rid of all of them, so we'll target these. This meant the British targeted proportionately less than a third as many Germans for denazification as did the Americans. With their security concerns, however, the British were especially leery of giving up control over denazification to Germans, and did so much later than the Americans or the French. Donald B. Robinson, who had worked on General Eisenhower's staff, you notice there are all these people that early on had worked with Eisenhower, complained bitterly in 1946 about U.S. military government political naivete and excuses of expediency for not purging Nazis from German governmental and industrial posts. He asserted that Nazi office holders did all they could to reinforce the American military government belief that only Nazis could do the work, since no one else had been able to acquire experience during the previous 12 years. He wrote, quote, "To military government officers in the field, it looked better to have the town in running order than to throw out a Nazi. And it seems safer to have a hospital functioning perfectly than to give a Hitlerite superintendent the bum's rush," end of quote. In many cases in both the US and the British zones, anti-Nazi Germans, even inexperienced ones, could have been trained on the job during the time these qualified but incriminated personnel were retained. In parts of the French zone, in the field of education, this is what happened, thanks to the French bringing in French educators to train new German teachers, an indication that such a policy was indeed possible. Many military government staff were engineers and technocrats in their civilian lives back in the US, a factor further contributing to pragmatic and expeditious approaches to getting the country running again, rather than pursuing political vetting of those Germans whose work they often considered apolitical to begin with. The technical aspects of the implementation of denazification in the US zone were handled initially by military government detachments without any special denazification training. They regarded denazification as burdensome and gave it lower priority than the task of securing housing, food, water, and power supplies. Responsibility for this purge was eventually given to a specially created special branch. Germans who held or applied for any middle or high-level position had to fill out detailed questionnaires about their career experience. These questionnaires in German, you probably know it as Fragebogen, about their career experience and political involvement. These Fragebogen were sorted out and categorized by special branch officers according to 5 levels of political incrimination. Then, if necessary, the individuals were to be investigated further and the appropriate action taken, whether dismissing the person from a post or blocking his or her property or assessing a fine or bringing them to trial. Altogether, some 13 million Fragebogen were submitted by the Germans living in the US zone. The investigation of the validity of the data and the decisions regarding action to be taken in each individual case required a considerable number of special branch officers and other military government personnel. As the number of Fragebogen increased and the need for personnel to process them expanded, more and more capable military personnel were, however, returning to the United States after their tour of duty had ended. Their replacements were fewer in number and less qualified, which further diminished the efficacy of the program. The immense number of Germans who needed to be vetted, 28% of all German adults in the US zone, compared to just over 10% in the British zone. And the decreasing number of qualified military government investigators led to various concessions and compromises in the denazification program. U.S. military government was short on personnel sufficiently familiar with the different levels of political incrimination. Often the least incriminated, followers or Mitläufer, were tried first in order to get them back to work. The trials of the least incriminated in the U.S. zone came at a time when punishment was most stringent, closest to the liberation of the concentration camps, and think about the image I showed you of people being forced to go through Bergen-Belsen. So the trials of the least incriminated in the US zone came at a time when punishment was most stringent and when few extenuating circumstances were considered. This would have serious repercussions when those categorized as more incriminated fell under later amnesties or received more lenient sentences as the entire program became increasingly discredited. By early 1946, Amnestys' denazification branch was receiving more and more complaints from German administrators and commerce and industry, as well as from other branches of military government, that economic, governmental, and other professional services that were crucial to getting German administrations functioning smoothly again could not operate if there were too many dismissals due to law number 8. The size and difficulty and thankless nature of the denazification process ultimately led military government to transfer the denazification proceedings to German tribunals under military government supervision with the March 1946 Law for Liberation from National Socialism and Militarism. Yet even before this March 1946 turnover, U.S. military government had allowed many in German industry and commerce to denazify themselves. Even prior to the September 1945 proclamation of Law Number 8, for example, military government allowed the Frankfurt Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which was run by leading business people, to license all firms for business except for those owned by individuals who had joined the Nazi Party prior to 1933. After denazification was turned over to the Germans, military government allowed the Frankfurt Chamber of Commerce and Industry to maintain a special liaison with the denazification tribunals. This German liaison monitored tribunal decisions involving business people in order to, quote, coordinate the interest of the economy with the effects of denazification on economic life. U.S. military government did eventually revise denazification policies, but in ways that gave rise to even more dissatisfaction among those Germans and Americans, like the original OSS planners, committed to the concept of a fundamental purge and democratization of society. Amnesties and individual exceptions and downgrading of categories of incrimination that military government made from mid-1946 on contradicted the principles behind the original concept of denazification in JCS 1067. Now, I hope you can see this. If you look, the poem, of course, is in German, but if you look at the top, those are, of course, wolves, black wolves, who are going through this cleansing process, and they come out as white sheep, or lambs, really. So you can imagine what that is about. I could read you the poem, but it's pretty in your face. So I'm talking about amnesties and individual exceptions and downgrading of categories of incrimination that military government made from mid-1946 on contradicted the principles behind the original concept of denazification in JCS 1067. The first amnesty, the youth amnesty, came in July 1946 already and absolved some 900,000 incriminated persons born after the 1st of January 1919 from almost all responsibility and thus penalties. Again, think about the Transitional Justice warning about impunity. The Christmas 1946 amnesty absolved a further 1 million relatively low-income and disabled persons who had been charged in the second and third highest categories of incrimination. Of those 1,400,000 offenders presumed to have been guilty of more than just going along, in other words, above the level of follower or Mitläufer, almost 80% were eventually charged as the more nominally incriminated lesser offenders, and almost all members of this Category 3 were automatically demoted to the lowest category, that of followers, because of a military government amendment promulgated in October 1947. So you're watching this whole process. As mere followers, these Germans no longer had to fear being penalized at all. Now, why this amendment? This amendment had been promulgated after a large group of U.S. congressional representatives visiting Germany became convinced that denazification was impeding German recovery and that its conclusion should be expedited. However, U.S. Congress was not satisfied with the results of this amendment, and in March 1948, the House Appropriations Committee refused to approve an Army appropriations bill for military government unless denazification was halted. These amnesties and amendments worked to the benefit of those originally charged in the more incriminated categories. Those presumed originally to be the least incriminated had been tried prior to these changes, during the period when more stringency and harsher punishments were exercised. Because of this sequence of prosecuting the little fish or small fry first, while eventually letting most of the big fish go, many of those who should have been removed from positions of authority in public administration, as well as in private industry, never even came to trial. The various levels of interpretation of the denazification directives and the schematic nature of denazification measures, the Herculean bureaucratic task of sorting through so many questionnaires with few personnel with skills adequate to judge one's incrimination, and the retreat into amnesties that those numbers probably made inevitable, as well as the general trend to place administrative efficiency and economic recovery over denazification and democratization. All this contributed to the shortcomings of the US denazification process. These shortcomings, in turn, worked often to the advantage of those Germans with the most complicity. All of this might have been avoided, the historian Alfons Sollner argues, if the criteria that the research and analysis branch of the OSS had produced had been used. The denazification proceedings in the US zone resulted in finding 200,000 Germans guilty, who were ordered to pay fines or endure what became temporary restrictions on employment or voting. This 200,000, interestingly enough, was a number that coincided with the total number the OSS originally wanted to investigate in the first place. All the Western allies retreated qualitatively and quantitatively from their original denazification goals. In the French case, épuration involved a system of punishment of individuals based less on schematic models of party membership or positions, but rather on behavior as the basis for determining responsibility for the crimes of the Nazis. The French occupiers were more inclined, at least in some regions, to turn procedures over to the Germans for a sort of auto-épuration. But because of fears of criticism for being too lenient, they reversed this course and ultimately retreated from denazification, switching their focus to cultural re-education. More conservative French occupiers hoped that the French civilizing mission would permeate sufficiently through German elites into German culture and hopefully eventually change the German spirit of submission and authoritarianism and collectivism, which the French subsumed under the label Prussianism. The size of the occupation force, I'm getting close, varied considerably among the three Western allies. The French probably had enough staff to investigate many more Germans, 6 times more than the Americans, and almost twice as many as the British relative to the German population of their zones. And yet the Americans started off with the most all-encompassing, ambitious, and schematic program of denazification, but then backing off, introducing amnesties, and downgrading categories of incrimination. Although compared to the French or the British, who were not particularly amenable to slowing down their processes by allowing much in the way of appeals or re-examination of systems, the Americans were, however, more likely to facilitate appeals processes where sentencing had occurred. So my comparisons between the zones and sectors will have to be a complex one, multi-layered, with much research still to be done. Now let me conclude by bringing us back to the framework of transitional justice. Everything always ends where it starts, right? How helpful the concept of transitional justice may be for my study of denazification, as I said, I am not yet sure. But even if it simply points out the differences and suggests that foreign powers cannot realistically hope to find truth or facilitate justice in the midst of military occupation, then perhaps this already tells us something. On the other hand, many of the debates in the development of experiments in and theories of transitional justice seem to echo differences and problems between the theory versus the practice of denazification, especially if insufficient civil society exists. Conceptualizing denazification as transitional justice requires positing the process as part of a reckoning with the recent past in pursuit of truth and justice, as prerequisites to reconciliation and ultimately democratization. If the goal of transitional justice is reconciliation, which is difficult in any traumatized post-conflict society, then it is especially difficult in one in which some victorious occupiers spouted accusations of collective guilt, while some among the occupied felt they were as much victimized by the Allies as those actually victimized by the Nazi regime. In other words, some semblance of coming to terms with truth and justice must occur prior to reconciliation. Denazification was, as conceived by the Allies, a prerequisite to reconciliation. But for the Allies, less a reconciliation among Germans, former Nazis, anti-Nazis, non-Nazis, than of Germans reconciling themselves to their defeat in order to achieve a rehabilitation that would make them worthy of re-entering the international community. Certainly, most Germans quickly became reconciled to membership in the Western international community, especially in the midst of the Cold War. And the West became reconciled to the need for an economically strong West Germany. But repression of the fact of complicity of so many Germans, either directly in or through indifference to the persecution of Jews, Sinti and Roma, leftist, pacifist, gays, the disabled, and so many others forced to work in Germany and across Europe, surely delayed both the revelation of truth and the pursuit of justice. Those Germans least complicit with the Nazi regime usually had the most interest in denazification as transitional justice, but were the least likely, at least in their lifetimes, to find its realization. In transitional justice theory, reconciliation is defined as a process, quote, through which a society moves from a divided past to a shared future. Although moving together toward economic reconstruction and reestablishing the rule of law did occur from the late 1940s onward in West Germany, recognizing and acknowledging responsibility for others' injustice and suffering as a prerequisite to reconciliation among Germans took much, much longer. Thank you. Is it just me or is it warm in here? Okay, I am going to take some questions. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Boehling. You mentioned, I think I understood, that one of the failings of denazification was possibly the contrast in the sectors between the percentages of inhabitants who were investigated. So 10%, I think, in the British sector, 28% in the American sector. But one of the criticisms of de-Baathification was that it cut way too deep, and that's why we have the Iraq that we have today. So how did your research inform the advice you gave to...
Well, I pretty much warned about everything, and those that asking me my advice were not the ones that actually planned de-Baathification. So, and that's important. And those that asked me at first didn't want to hear what I had to say, but they did. As I said, I got someone to go to South Africa to look at other models, to think about the differences in the countries, and to think about the fact that the Baathists had been in power much, much longer than the Nazis and what that would mean. And that, as you say, one of the major problems is that if you try to encompass so many people in a society, you're going to alienate so many. The numbers are going to make it almost impossible bureaucratically to proceed with the process. And you're going to have to rely on locals to look at behavior. As Germans, you all know about Persilscheine and all of this, that people literally would write accounts for each other of why this person is deserving and wasn't really a Nazi. And Persilscheine, if you have paid attention to our laundry room upstairs, fellows, it's often Persil, which is a kind of detergent. So Persilscheine is literally the idea of whitewashing your past. So that this kind of, I think a process like that where you're including so many people, just besides the logistics of how are you going to get through that and what's going to happen to those people. Now, the British actually did not prevent people from working during that time unless they were highly incriminated. So during the time that they were being investigated or awaiting their denazification process, they could work. But the Americans had restrictions. Again, one of the things that I didn't have a chance to go into in great detail here is the fact that even with all these policies, there were some incredible inconsistencies along the way, and I was trying to give you some sense of that by looking at the example of the Frankfurt Chamber of Commerce and Industry and how that even with the policies, they weren't often completely, there were always exceptions made, et cetera, and connections. What makes it so complicated with military government is that you also had very different people in very different positions. In special branch, you had frequently people who were pretty well educated and well informed about Germany that often had the language skills, etc. But in general military government, you did not. Yes.
Thank you. I learned a lot from that. You gave a lot of excellent reasons for why denazification failed. Sorry.
Yes.
But one thing that you didn't talk about is the thesis is a much more ideological thesis, namely that as the Cold War heated up, it was actually much less important to the Allies to get rid of old Nazis than to find anti-communist allies. And I wonder what you think of that claim.
Well, I think it's very much tied in with the idea of the emphasis on economic reconstruction, because the turn from being so concerned with dealing with the Nazi situation to then dealing with the communist situation, there was a real fear that if the economy was not recovering quickly enough, that Germans would be drawn into support for communist and support for the Soviet zone, et cetera. So I think that you have to, I mean, if you look at Secretary of State James Burns at the time, that was already in September 1946 that he announces a turn away from the more sort of negative, punitive aspects of the occupation to economic reconstruction.
But in Burns's papers, for example, how explicit is that? That it's really much more important to be, or in other things you found in the archives, it's really much more important to worry about the communists than about the Nazis.
Oh, you find, I mean, it's definitely there. I mean, my initial work was dealing with local materials, and you see it there. You see it less among. What's interesting is you see it less among people who are on the ground working than you see it in the State Department and the Office of the Political Advisor, et cetera. So it really makes a difference. I think people on the ground were not thinking, I've got to get local utilities working again or get this firm working again so that communists don't take hold. I think they were thinking, this is my town and I'm going to get it working again, just like I would at home. So sort of pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of thing. So this was much more true of the reason in the American zone than it was in the British zone. In the British zone, it was more like, we can't keep pumping money in here when we have enough problems at home. And of course, the situation in the British zone, which was primarily industrial and very little agriculture, was quite different. There were serious, serious food shortages in the British zone.
To what extent do you think that the shall we say, the relative lack of success of denazification was at the source of what went on after the reunification of Germany and the transition in the former DDR, which seems to me to have sort of just occurred with very little, if you will, retribution or accountability among the part of that regime.
I think if you think of the large number of internment camps in the Soviet zone, you would think of that somewhat differently, which was, of course, not just targeting Nazis. It was also, very politicized. But I think it's wrong to think that the Soviets did not denazify. I mean, the way they looked at denazification.
After the reunification, when
But you're assuming that there had not been denazification in the Soviet zone, which allowed.
No, I'm not talking about denazification. I'm talking destasification, if you would like to.
Okay, I don't think that you can compare Nazi Germany with East Germany. I don't think it's an appropriate comparison. So I think that you could say that perhaps the model of transitional justice could have applied more because it was within one society, but of course a society that had been divided for more than a generation, really 2 generations. So I really don't see the comparisons in the same way, and I guess I hesitate to compare.
Some people who spend time in the Hohenschönhausen prison might disagree with you, but
Yes, but they would not they would not have been through the same situation 40 years before.
That's true.
So, I mean, it's always dangerous to, comparisons are important, but you have to be careful about relativizing and fitting things in where they don't fit. Boy, lots of hands.
Thank you for the lecture. I want to come back to your putting the denazification within the concept of transitional justice. And my question is, do you think that it is possible to have a purge and a truth commission approach at the same time? Or do the two, in the size of denazification in Germany, contradict each other?
I don't know if you can have them at the same time in a military occupation context. I mean, that was one of the points I wanted to make with that. But I do think that it's very important that whatever, and this is coming partly from my reading about transitional justice in the last months, that it's so important to do something quickly. I mean, you don't want to wait too long. There's a window, if you will. And there's, of course, always the pressures of society goes on, life goes on. But if you don't, I think that you can't really have truth commissions without having some element of a purge at the same time, because if you're trying to hold people accountable, there's got to be something more than just confessing, if you will, or reporting what happened. I think it has to go a step beyond that. Also, of course, I'm talking very broadly. It depends on one's actions, etc. But I think that the way the Americans approached denazification was just far too broad, without any real sense of the reality of what will happen, just like with debathification, if you try to include such a large mass of the population. Who is going to support you in it, and how are these people going to be reintegrated into society?
The fact that Congress made it a condition for appropriation of money for the military in March '48, was that related to the coup in Prague in February '48? Because it was also in March '48 that Congress finally agreed to spending the money on the European Recovery Program. And that had taken almost 10 months or so until Congress agreed to it. So I wonder whether there's a causal connection. But maybe just one more point. I read a book that was very interesting on civilizing the enemy, which focuses on the problem that you had to switch from the anti-Nazi, anti-German propaganda back home in America so moving the Germans to the Western civilization side and focusing on the communist, Asian, whatever type of propaganda.
Okay, those are two pretty different questions. In terms of the appropriations, I don't know, but my guess would be that given that it was holding up money for the U.S. Army, that would not have conformed with concerns about what was going on in terms of the Czech coup, or the Soviet coup in Czechoslovakia. So I don't think that it would have made sense that was one and the same. You've got to also always remember that your Foreign Relations Committee are quite different from your Army Appropriations Committee, et cetera. And I fear in the near future that things will be even more discordant with that regard and less integrated. But I think even then, you don't see that kind of immediate reaction within weeks. You certainly see moves for discussions about intervention, et cetera. But if anything, the military would have been strengthened, and they would not have been playing around with an appropriations bill like that from that perspective. Sorry, your second question was... oh, okay.
Anti-communist, anti-Western civilization.
Well, you actually see that happen fairly quickly even after World War I. You've got to remember, as short-lived as the United States' involvement in World War I was, it involved there being a stop to teaching German in the U.S. and all sorts of things, but that didn't last very long once the war was over. So I would argue actually that there's a much longer lasting and probably stronger anti-German sentiment in Britain, lasting long into today, than there is in the U.S. I think what makes, if I bring this up again to the level of denazification, you need to think about the fact that the British and French primary concern with denazification was security. I mean, they remembered all too well what it was like to have a German invasion, whether from the air or from the ground, and they knew the effects. Whereas for the U.S., with all sorts of ethnic and genealogical ties to Germany, it was really very hard to have any kind of long-lasting anti-German sentiment. I mean, when I think about the failure of fraternization, anti-fraternization policies, et cetera, beyond gender issues involved in that. I think maybe two more questions.
Not ladies first? Okay, great. I just want to make two brief comments. At one point in my life, I, at the behest of Paul Wolfowitz, wrote a memorandum on denazification, but this came very, very late. This was already in the summer of 2003, so this is about how late he got around even to thinking about it. I won't mention the content of the memo or the result of it, but I think the second key point is that it wouldn't have made any difference anyway. If the Iraqi army had been maintained and if there had been no de-Baathification, there would have been a Shiite uprising. And with de-Baathification and the dissolution of the Iraqi army, we had a Sunni uprising. But the effect of this on the extent of the fiasco would have been nil. It would have been a bloody fiasco no matter how you cut it. And the second point, more closely to your theme, is the need to look at the Soviets. Prior to the Soviets' own elections of 1946, they themselves instituted a policy of lenience toward the small PGs. In fact, they allowed some of them to enter the SED, and this had an effect on American policy because the Americans said, my God, they're pandering to the small PGs, we better not let them get a jump on us. And I think this, if I remember
just
correctly...
Just as a reference, PG is Parteigenosse, party member.
Excuse me, Parteigenosse, okay. And if I remember correctly, and maybe I don't remember correctly, and you do, but I believe this was one of the main reasons for Clay convening the Murphy Denazification Committee that then led to this whole business of the Brazil, China, and the denazification commissions. So, okay.
Just as a quick response, I do think that it is connected to the decision to turn over the process to German tribunals. But I don't think that it was, I think nominal membership was also not supposed to be subject to real penalty. It was, you were either a follower or you were exonerated. So being this nominal Parteigenosse, or PG as you put it, was not all that different, although it did mean that you had to first be screened, which is what created the volume.
They were really making a lot of noise about it, much more than we did. In fact, there's even this joke about how the new motto of the SED is SED, Partei der Climate PGs.
So actively recruiting. Well, indirectly, later parties in parts of Western Germany also did, during the occupation period, also did the same. I think about the Wiederaufbauvereinigung, etc. So it was a little less explicit, and it came somewhat later in 47, 48.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Was there any discussion in relation to the distribution of military scientists in particular in terms of denazification policy? We know the end result, they were all parsed out, but was that part of the discussion at all?
I talked about lawyers and doctors, but scientists per se were not targeted as such, but they were targeted for their scientific knowledge. I encourage you on Thursday to come to a talk here at the American Academy by one of my fellows, and on 1945 and Operation Paperclip and all of that. So I think I'll postpone that for that discussion. And she's going, I'm going to be there, don't worry. One more, okay.
Thank you. I was wondering if you can say something about the discussion around denazification, discourses around denazification within American policy circles, because I know that the American press looked at the progress of denazification very critically, and especially the whole idea of the Fragebogen, of the questionnaires, was regarded with a lot of criticism, because the press mainly said that, don't you see that you're trying to defeat Nazism with its own means, with a sense of efficiency, and trying to fit such an emotional topic into such a ready-made scheme here. So how did American foreign policy circles reflect on their own progress in Germany in connection to that?
I'm not so familiar with that level of criticism at the Fragebogen. I certainly know that there was often criticism when there were discoveries that there was a mayor with a very problematic past who had been retained in office or appointed to office. I think about Aachen, one of the first places that occurred. I think of the work of someone like Saul Padover and his the way that people in special branch or even in the OSS would try, or the Information Control Division, which was, of course, the press side of military government, early on definitely tried to make sure that there was a thorough denazification. So that sort of bureaucratic side of this is not emotional, et cetera, I think the kind of press coverage that was coming out of Germany from the American press in terms of discoveries about the past and the Nuremberg trials, et cetera, were certainly not saying this is not emotional. So this is news to me. I can't really, from what I know of, I think about Life magazine and the New York Times and that kind of thing. I mean, there was a criticism of denazification not being stringent enough. but not the idea of a criticism per se of the questionnaire. I mean, Ernst von Soloway was hardly an American in his very critical novel, Der Fragebogen.
Convene and we can continue informally over drinks, but thank you for a wonderful